She was 22 years old, and for all intents and purposes, her life was over before it had truly begun. She was penniless, dispossessed, with no family to turn to and no prospects to speak of. All she had to her name was a single trunk containing her few worldly goods, a small, worn silver thimble in her pocket, and a solicitor's draft for £20, the final dismissive payment for a lifetime of dutiful silence. And with that sum, a pittance that would scarcely keep a lady for a month, she bought a ruin. Not just any ruin, but the old Dower house on the edge of the Blackwood Manor estate in the heart of Kent. The villagers of Oakhaven called it the Rookery, for the birds that had claimed its crumbling chimneys, and they called Sarah Lockwood a fool for wasting good money on it. They saw a slip of girl with quiet eyes and hands, accustomed to needlework, and they pitied her, or mocked her in equal measure. They saw the damp-streaked stone, the roof that sagged like a tired old horse, the windows staring out like vacant eyes, and they shook their heads. The house was a ghost, a forgotten appendage to the magnificent Blackwood Manor that loomed on the nearby hill, a testament to the power and prosperity of the Cartwright family. But what nobody in Oakhaven knew, what the solicitor who took her money with a sigh of condescension did not know, was that sealed away behind a plain wooden panel inside that derelict house was a secret. It was a story of betrayal and a treasure left behind, a dowager's final, defiant act, waiting for a kindred spirit to find it. It was something that would not only give Sarah a future, but would also rewrite the past and change the balance of power in that quiet corner of the English countryside forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sarah Lockwood and the house that was waiting for her. We would be so glad to know where you are watching from today, to feel the community that gathers around these tales. Sarah Lockwood's life had been a study in the art of being invisible. Born to parents she never knew, who had perished from a fever when she was but an infant, she was taken in as a ward by a distant cousin of her mother's, a merchant named Mr. Elias Thorne. She was raised in his tall, narrow London house, a place of polished silence and regulated hours. She was not family, a fact made clear not through outright cruelty, but through 1,000 small omissions. She ate with the family, but was never asked her opinion. She was dressed in respectable grey wool, but was never given the silks and ribbons afforded to the Thorne daughters. She was a shadow in their household, a duty honorably, if coldly, fulfilled. Her only true solace was found below stairs in the warm, fragrant kingdom of the housekeeper, Mrs. Elspeth Gable. Mrs. Gable was a widow, a woman whose face was a roadmap of sorrows, but whose hands were instruments of astonishing competence. She saw in the quiet, observant Sarah not a burden, but a spirit of uncommon steadiness, and so she taught her. She taught her how to keep household accounts with a ledger and a sharp pencil, her handwriting becoming as neat and precise as Mrs. Gable's own. She taught her the language of the kitchen, how to render suet, preserve summer fruits in jewel-toned jars, and bake a loaf of bread whose crust would crackle just so. In the small walled garden behind the house, she learned which herbs soothed a fever and which eased a cough. She learned to mend, to darn a sock so finely the repair was a work of art, and to sew a seam as straight as a surveyor's line. From Mrs. Gable, Sarah learned that work was a kind of prayer, and that competence was a shield against the world's indifference. 1 year before Sarah was turned out, Mrs. Gable had given her a gift. It was a simple silver thimble worn smooth with use, its surface decorated with a tiny faded pattern of forget-me-nots. "It was my mother's, Mrs." Gable had said, her voice low and rough. "She was a seamstress. A good one. It will protect your finger, child, and perhaps remind you that a woman with a skill is never truly helpless." Sarah treasured it, carrying it always in the small pocket of her apron. It was a tangible link to the only unconditional affection she had ever known. When Mrs. Gable succumbed to a sudden inflammation of the lungs that winter, The last buffer between Sarah and the cold charity of the Thorns was gone. Sarah grieved her mentor silently, the thimble a cold, hard knot in her palm. She knew with the quiet certainty that had become her nature that her time in that house was drawing to a close. The end came not with a shouted argument or a dramatic scene, but with the dry rustle of paper. 3 months after the death of Mr. Thorne himself, his son, a man with his father's ambition but none of his grudging sense of duty, took possession of the house and his inheritance. His wife, a woman of fashionable opinions and brittle smiles, saw Sarah's quiet presence as a reproach, a lingering relic of a past she was eager to sweep away. On a Tuesday morning in early April, a letter arrived for Sarah, delivered not by the housemaid but by a clerk from a firm of solicitors. The envelope was thick and creamy, the address written in an impersonal, looping script. She took it to her small attic room, a space she had occupied for 20 years, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. Her hands were steady as she broke the wax seal. The language of the letter was polite, formal, and utterly devastating. It informed her, in clauses dense with legal jargon, that with the passing of her former guardian, the informal arrangement providing for her keep was now terminated. The new Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, it stated, wished her well in her future endeavors. As a final gesture of goodwill, in recognition of her long association with the family, they had instructed the solicitor to provide her with a bank draft for the sum of £20. She was requested to vacate the premises within a fortnight. There was no mention of her years of unpaid assistance to Mrs. Gable, no acknowledgement of the quiet, seamless way she had managed the household stores and linens after the housekeeper's death. It was an administrative erasure of her entire existence. Sarah read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on her bedside table. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she had never been able to afford. Instead, she began to work. She opened her small wooden trunk and began to pack. The process was methodical, a quiet ritual of farewell. She folded her few gray and brown dresses, her starched collars and cuffs, her mended stockings. She wrapped the handful of books Mrs. Gable had given her, a collection of Shakespeare, a book of herbal remedies, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Lastly, she took the silver thimble from her sewing box and slipped it into the pocket of her dress. She left behind nothing that was not hers. On the final morning, she carried her own trunk down the 3 flights of stairs. The house was silent. The family was pointedly absent. The new housemaid, a girl she did not know, averted her eyes as Sarah passed. At the front door, she set down the trunk, her breath misting in the cool spring air. She pulled the heavy oak door closed behind her, and the latch clicked shut with a sound of profound and irreversible finality. The journey from London to Kent was a passage from one world to another. Sarah sat in the corner of a public coach, her trunk secured on the roof, the 20-pound draft folded safely in her bodice. For the first few hours, the view was a repeating pattern of brick and slate, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the press of humanity. But gradually, the city frayed at the edges. The tight rows of houses gave way to market gardens, then to open fields bordered by hedgerows thick with the white blossoms of blackthorn. The sky, washed clean by a recent shower, was a pale, hopeful blue. The air that drifted through the open window of the coach smelled of damp earth and new grass. Sarah watched the rolling landscape unfold with a quiet, focused intensity. This was the county her parents had come from. Though she knew not where, she felt not a sense of homecoming, but the keen, alert apprehension of a traveler in a foreign land. She had chosen Oak Haven from a list of villages in a gazetteer, for one reason only: the brief, uninviting advertisement she had seen in a London paper for a small dower house, in need of repair, sold as is. The price had been shockingly low, and she knew it was the only property her £20 might secure. The coach deposited her and her trunk in the center of the village. Oakhaven was a small, compact place, nestled in a gentle valley. A single main street was flanked by a baker's, a butcher's, and a public house called the Cartwright Arms. A stone church with a square Norman tower stood at one end, its graveyard dotted with leaning stones. As she stood by her trunk, waiting for the coach to rumble away, she felt the weight of curious eyes. Women paused with their baskets, and the blacksmith, his face smudged with soot, stopped his hammering to watch her. She was an outsider, a lone woman with a single piece of luggage and an uncertain purpose. She arranged for a boy with a cart to transport her trunk later, and after a brief, discouraging visit to the local solicitor, to sign the final papers and collect the key, she set out on foot. The Dower house was a mile from the village, down a lane rutted by farm carts. As she walked, the grand gates of Blackwood Manor appeared on her left, all wrought iron and imposing stone griffins. Through the bars she could see a long, sweeping drive and the magnificent facade of the house, a symphony of warm red brick and white stone quoins. It was a picture of wealth, confidence, and dynastic power. She walked on, and soon the lane narrowed, overgrown with nettles and cow parsley. And then she saw it, tucked behind a screen of overgrown yew trees. Almost hidden from the lane was the Dower house. It was smaller than she had imagined, and more derelict. The stone was gray and stained with green moss, and several slates had slipped from the roof, leaving dark, gaping holes. A shutter hung from a single hinge, knocking softly in the breeze. It looked less like a house and more like a ruin, something slowly being reclaimed by the patient, relentless forces of nature. Her heart did not sink. It settled into a place of grim resolve. This was it. This was what £20 could buy. It was nothing, but it was hers. The key was a monstrous thing, a foot long and made of heavy, pitted iron. It felt cold and ancient in her hand. The solicitor, a man named Mr. Abernathy, with a perpetually worried expression, had handed it to her as if it were a contagion, his sigh fogging the air in his dusty office. "The deeds are in order, Miss Lockwood," he had said, "though what you intend to do with the place is beyond me." Now, standing before the peeling, sun-blistered door, Sarah fitted the key into the lock. It took both her hands and all her strength to turn it. The mechanism inside groaned, a sound of deep, metallic protest, and then with a final, shuddering clank, the bolt slid back. The door swung inward on complaining hinges, opening into a gloom that smelled of 100 winters of damp, of mouse droppings, and the fine, silty dust of decay. She stepped across the threshold into a small, flag-stoned hall. To her right, a staircase with a beautifully turned, if rickety, newel post climbed into the shadows of the upper floor. To her left was a doorway into what must have been the parlor. Straight ahead, another door led to the kitchen. She went into the parlor first. It was a well-proportioned room, with a high ceiling and a wide stone fireplace, its hearth choked with a solid mass of ancient soot and fallen debris. Thick, spectral cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams like ruined chandeliers. The plaster on the walls was a cracked and bubbled landscape of pale green and gray, peeling away in large sheets to reveal the lath beneath. A single broken-backed chair lay on its side in the center of the floor, its horsehair stuffing spilling from a gash in the velvet. Yet, beneath the grime and neglect, there were signs of a quiet, stubborn elegance. The proportions of the room were perfect. The deep-set window, though its leaded panes were filmed with dirt and cracked in several places, looked out onto the ghost of a walled garden. On the wall above the fireplace, a cleaner, rectangular patch of plaster spoke of a portrait that had hung there for many years. She ran a gloved finger along the oak mantelpiece. It was carved with a delicate pattern of interwoven vines and roses, a detail of astonishing artistry, now almost completely obscured by layers of grime. The oak was cold and solid beneath her touch. This was not work of a common builder. This was the work of a craftsman. She moved through the rest of the house with the same methodical calm. The kitchen was a cavern of stone and shadow, with a huge rusted range and a stone sink. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms mirrored the layout below, their floors thick with dust and the droppings of birds who had found their way in through the damaged roof. In one room, a gust of wind rattled a loose window frame, a lonely, percussive sound. She was not daunted, she was not overwhelmed. Her mind, trained by Mrs. Gable in the arts of assessment and management, was already making lists. The roof first, then the windows, then the plaster. It was a mountain of work, a task for a dozen men, not one young woman. But as she stood in the center of the dusty parlor, the silence of the empty house settling around her, she felt not fear, but a strange and unfamiliar sensation, the feeling of standing on her own ground. The discovery did not happen in a flash of insight, but unfolded slowly, a reward for patient labor. In the first weeks, Sarah worked from dawn until dusk, her efforts focused on the most immediate and overwhelming task: cleaning. She swept away thick blankets of dust and cobwebs, scrubbed the flagstone floors with lye soap and cold water from the well, and cleared the hearth of its impacted mass of soot and fallen nests. It was during this process, on a gray Thursday afternoon, that her attention was drawn to the parlor fireplace. She had been scraping away the grime from the wooden paneling that flanked the stone mantel. The paneling was dark oak, almost black with age and dirt, constructed of simple, severe rectangles. As she worked on the section to the right of the hearth, her scraper caught on a seam that was not quite like the others. Where the other panels met with a visible V-shaped groove, this vertical line was almost invisible, a hairline crack masquerading as a join. She stopped, her heart giving a small, curious flutter. She ran her fingers over it. It was perfectly smooth. Puzzled, she pressed gently on the panel. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, leaning her weight into it. Still nothing. Remembering a trick Mrs. Gable had shown her for opening a stubborn pantry door, she tapped the panel in a specific sequence: top, bottom, then the middle of the right-hand edge. There was a faint click, a sound no louder than a beetle scuttling across the floor. The hairline crack widened. The panel had shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. Her breath caught in her throat. Using her fingertips, she carefully pulled the panel towards her. It swung open silently on a set of small, well-oiled brass hinges, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity within the wall. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, smelling faintly of leather and cedar. Inside, resting on a small wooden shelf, were 2 objects. The first was a heavy, leather-bound box, about the size of a loaf of bread, its surface tooled with a faded gold design. The second was a packet wrapped in oilskin and tied securely with twine. With trembling hands, Sarah lifted out the box. It was unexpectedly heavy. She set it on the floor and unfastened the small brass clasp. The lid opened to reveal a lining of faded blue velvet, and nestled within were jewels that caught the dim afternoon light and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. There were ropes of pearls, thick and lustrous, a diamond brooch in the shape of a starburst, earrings of emerald and gold, heavy rings set with sapphires and rubies. It was a fortune. Stunned, she turned to the oilskin packet. She untied the twine and unfolded the stiff, waxy cloth. Inside was a sheaf of papers and a single thick letter, sealed with a crest she did not recognize. She broke the seal. The letter was written in a fine, elegant hand. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. It began, "To whoever finds this, in a time I cannot know." It was signed, Eleanor Vance, Dowager of this parish, October 1788. The letter told a story of profound betrayal. Eleanor Vance had been the sole heiress to the entire estate, the land that now comprised Blackwood Manor and its extensive grounds. Her cousin, a charismatic and ruthless man named Richard Cartwright, had used his position as executor of her father's will to systematically defraud her, using forged documents and legal chicanery to transfer the title of the land to himself. He built his grand manor on her inheritance, and as a final insult, constructed this small dower house for her, a gilded cage where she was to live out her days in silent obscurity. The other documents were the proof, the original deed in her name and a signed confession from a clerk whom Cartwright had bribed. "I leave these jewels my mother's dowry, and this testimony," Eleanor wrote, "in the hope that they may one day fall into the hands of a woman of spirit, one who knows what it is to be wronged and cast aside. May this give you shelter, and may this truth in your hands become a sword. Do with it what you will." Sarah sat back on her heels on the dusty floor, the letter in her lap, the jewels winking beside her. She felt an extraordinary connection to this woman she had never met, a sister in spirit across 70 years of silence. She was no longer alone in this house. Sarah read the letter 3 times, the elegant script blurring and sharpening before her eyes. The weight of Eleanor Vance's story settled upon her not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. Her first instinct was not vengeance. The thought of marching to Blackwood Manor and confronting the current Mr. Cartwright, a man she had only glimpsed from a distance, felt alien to her nature. Her mind, practical and methodical, turned instead to the house itself. Eleanor had wished her shelter. Before she could wield the truth as a sword, she would first build her shield. The jewels provided the means. The following week, she took a coach to Maidstone, a larger town where she was not known. There, she sought out a reputable jeweler, a quiet, elderly man with a watchmaker's loop permanently affixed to his eye. She sold a single piece, a heavy gold chain, for a sum that felt staggering in its immensity. With this capital, the real work could begin. Her first priority was the roof. She sought out the man the villagers had told her was the best, a retired slater named Silas Finch. He was a gnarled, wiry man in his late 60s, with hands like knotted roots, and a face weathered by a lifetime of wind and rain. He came to the house, looked at the sagging roof, looked at Sarah, and grunted. "It's a big job for one girl." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "That's why I need to hire you." He saw the money she offered, counted it carefully, and then nodded once. "I'll need a lad to help me carry, but I'll show you how to mix the mortar. No sense payin' for what you can learn to do yourself." For 2 weeks, the air around the Dower house was filled with the rhythmic chip-chip-chip of Mr. Finch's slate hammer and the scrape of trowels. Sarah became his apprentice, hauling buckets of water, learning the precise consistency of lime mortar, and how to bed the heavy gray slates so they would shed the rain for another 100 years. Next came the windows. The village blacksmith, Mr. Davies, was able to repair the broken hinges and latches, his hammer blows ringing a steady rhythm in his smoky forge. Sarah herself learned to replace the cracked leaded panes, carefully cutting the new glass and setting it with putty, her nimble fingers, accustomed to the fine work of a needle, proving adept at the task. One evening, as she was working late, cleaning soot from the parlor walls, a knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Davies, the blacksmith's wife, a round-faced woman with kind eyes. She held a basket covered with a cloth. "I saw your light," she said simply. "Thought you might be hungry." Inside was a hot meat pie and a small jug of ale. Sarah, exhausted and covered in grime, felt a lump form in her throat. It was the first unsolicited act of kindness she had received since her arrival. The rebuilding was slow, painstaking work. She learned the craft of plastering from Mr. Finch, applying the wet, heavy mixture to the lath walls with a hawk and trowel until her arms ached. She stripped the grime from the oak beams and paneling, revealing the wood's warm, honeyed glow. And in the garden, with the help of a young farmer named Thomas Green, who offered the use of his horse and cart to clear the worst of the brambles, she began to uncover the bones of Eleanor's design. Stone paths, the gnarled trunks of ancient apple trees, and the stubborn, thorny canes of what she hoped were rose bushes. Each repaired slate, each clean pane of glass, each cleared patch of earth was an act of reclamation. She was not just restoring a house, she was building a home, Slowly, inexorably, the rookery transformed. The sagging roof now ran in straight, clean lines of gray slate. The windows, clean and whole, caught the morning sun. A plume of wood smoke rose from one of the chimneys, a cheerful signal of life within. The villagers, who had first pointed and whispered, now watched with a grudging, then a genuine respect. They stopped calling it the rookery. Sarah, in her own mind and in quiet conversation, began to call it Vance House, a silent tribute to its first mistress. Her own position in the village began to shift. She was no longer the foolish girl who bought a ruin. She was Miss Lockwood of Vance House, a woman of mysterious means and formidable industry. Her days settled into a new rhythm. The hard, physical labor of restoration was now interwoven with the gentle arts of homemaking she had learned from Mrs. Gable. The kitchen, with its scrubbed stone sink and polished range, was once again a place of warmth and fragrant steam. She baked her own bread. She made jams from the wild blackberries that grew along the lane and sold her surplus eggs and vegetables at a small stall in the weekly market. People began to speak to her, their curiosity tempered by admiration. Mr. Finch would stop by on his walks to inspect the roof, always accepting a cup of tea. Mrs. Davies became a regular visitor, the two women sitting in the clean, bright parlor, their conversation a comfortable exchange of village news and gardening tips. Thomas Green, the young farmer, would often find a reason to be passing by, his shy greetings and offers of help becoming more frequent. With her home secure and a small but steady community forming around her, Sarah knew it was time to address the second part of Eleanor's legacy. She did not want a war. She wanted justice, a quiet rebalancing of the scales. She traveled again, this time to Canterbury, and retained a solicitor, an older, shrewder man than Mr. Abernathy. On his advice, she did not file a lawsuit. Instead, a letter was sent to Mr. Alistair Cartwright at Blackwood Manor, requesting a private meeting. Mr. Cartwright, a man whose authority had never been questioned, agreed out of sheer curiosity. The meeting took place not at the Grand Manor, but in Sarah's parlor. She served tea. Then her solicitor, Mr. Howell, calmly laid out the contents of Eleanor Vance's hidden cache. He presented a meticulously copied version of her letter, a surveyor's report on the historical value of the stolen land, and a legal opinion on the strength of their claim. Alistair Cartwright's face, at first condescending, turned pale as he read. Sarah watched him, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not speak. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Mr. Howell stated their terms. They did not ask for the land back. They did not ask for the house. They asked for two things: a public, formal acknowledgement of the historical injustice done to Eleanor Vance, to be recorded in the parish register, and the establishment of a perpetual charitable fund in Eleanor's name, endowed by the Cartwright estate, to provide for the education of the village's children and the care of its poor. The fund was to be administered by a board of trustees, to include the vicar, a village representative, and Miss Sarah Lockwood. Faced with irrefutable proof and the threat of a public scandal that would shatter his family's reputation, Alistair Cartwright had no choice. He agreed to everything. It was a victory won not with shouting, but with quiet, unassailable truth. The fire whispered in the grate, casting a warm, dancing light across the parlor of Vance House. Outside, a gentle autumn rain pattered against the window panes, each one now secure in its leading. The room was simple, but filled with a profound sense of peace. The walls were a soft, creamy white, the oak beams glowed with the patina of beeswax, and a vase of late-blooming roses from the reclaimed garden sat on a small table, their scent a faint, sweet perfume in the air. Sarah sat in a wing-backed chair she had bought in Maidstone and reupholstered herself, her hands resting on the worn arms. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, the first thing she had ever touched in this house. Upon its polished surface, two small silver objects sat side by side, One was the locket she had kept from Eleanor Vance's jewel case, a simple, elegant oval she had chosen from all the glittering diamonds and pearls. The other was the thimble Mrs. Gable had given her, its surface of forget-me-nots worn, almost smooth. They were talismans from two women she had never known as family, but who had, in their own ways, been her benefactors. One had given her the skills to survive, the belief in the power of her own two hands. The other had given her a place to use those skills, a home, a history, and a cause. They were strangers, separated by class and by time, yet their legacies were now intertwined on this mantelpiece, in this house that work and whispered hope had brought back to life. She thought of the Thorns, of the cold, silent house in London, and the solicitor's letter that had felt like a death sentence. She thought of the villagers who had mocked her, their pity like stones thrown at her back. And she thought of Alistair Cartwright, his face pale and tight in this very room, his inherited power crumbling before a truth written 70 years before. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet, settled satisfaction. The first meeting of the Vance Trust had been held the week before in the vestry of the church. The fund was established, its purpose clear. Eleanor's name, once erased, was now spoken with respect in the village, her story a local legend. The stolen inheritance had been transformed, not back into land, but into opportunity for generations to come. Sarah Lockwood had arrived in Oakhaven at 22, penniless and alone, with £20 to her name. She had spent it all on a ruin, an act of desperation that everyone had called folly. She looked around her at the warm, solid walls of her home, a sanctuary built of stone and plaster, of patience and discovery. It was, she knew with absolute certainty, the best £20 she had ever spent. The story of a house is always the story of the people who live within it, and sometimes of those who have been lost to it. Sarah's story reminds us that what we inherit is not always what is written in a will. Sometimes the most valuable legacies are hidden, left behind not as land or titles, but as skills, as stories, as acts of quiet defiance waiting for the right person to find them. The world saw a derelict building, a lost cause, a place to be torn down or ignored. Sarah, armed with the competence taught by a kind housekeeper and a spirit of quiet endurance, saw the bones of a home. She looked past the decay and saw the craftsmanship of the mantel, the elegant proportions of the rooms, the ghost of a garden waiting to bloom again. Her story is a testament to the power of seeing value where others see none, and the profound truth that patient, steady work can transform not only a place but a life. We often think of inheritance as something passed down through bloodlines, a direct transfer of wealth and status. But perhaps the most powerful inheritances are those of the spirit, connections formed across time with those who have faced similar struggles. Eleanor Vance could not have known who would find her letter. She could only hope it would be someone who would understand, someone who could use her story not just for personal gain, but for a greater good. In Sarah, her hope found its home. The community that grew around Sarah was not built on grand pronouncements of friendship, but on small, practical acts. A shared skill, a hot meal, the loan of a cart. It was a community forged in the shared respect for hard work and resilience. If Sarah's story of finding strength in what was abandoned has resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel, where we continue to unearth these tales of quiet fortitude. We invite you to share this story with someone who appreciates the beauty of patient craft and unexpected second chances. It is in the sharing of these stories that their lessons continue to breathe. And now, we leave you with a thought to carry into your own world. Look around at the overlooked corners of your life, your community. What forgotten dower houses are waiting there? And what is the most valuable thing you have ever found? Not in a shop, but in a place that someone else had thrown away.